world moves fast. Your workday, even faster. Pitching products, drafting reports, analyzing data. Microsoft 365 Copilot is your AI assistant for work. Built into Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and other Microsoft 365 apps you use. Helping you quickly write, analyze, create, and summarize. So you can cut through clutter and clear a path to your best work. Learn more at Microsoft.com/M365 Copilot.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
What's up, everybody? It's Will Cooper, and we're coming back with another episode of the HuntStand podcast. On today's episode, we're going to be talking how to hunt deer in the spring. Now, I know some of y'all might be thinking, Will, buddy, there's no deer season going on right now, man. Yep, I know that. But there's ways that we're still chasing after deer this time of year. You know, snow's starting to melt, antlers are dropping and hitting the ground. Deer doing some different things, or you're trying to see if maybe those deer left a sign behind to try and formulate a better game plan for the fall. Or you might have a new piece of property that you're trying to figure out. Or you had a buck that slipped past you, figured out he lived, and you're trying to put together a game plan for next fall so you can hopefully kill him. We're going to be bringing on special guest Josh Honeycutt to talk more in depth on this. I'm really going to be picking his brain on this, trying to find out what he's been doing this time of year. Now, Josh is a very, very avid deer hunter. And if you know anything about Josh, he's done a lot for Realtree in the past. He's been heavily involved in the outdoor industry, and he's got a lot of work that has appeared in different publications ranging from North American Whitetail, Whitetail Journal, Field and Stream, Outdoor Life, and a lot more. You may have even seen him shooting some big bucks on TV. But nonetheless, Josh is a great, genuine dude. He's from Kentucky. He's hunted all the way from South Carolina to South Dakota, but spends most of his time hunting Kentucky now. But Josh he's just a great overall dude, and he's a heck of a killer. And so we're going to be bringing Josh on to talk, more or less this springtime scouting tips and tactics. And so if you've been kind of trying to figure that out for yourself and wondering what to do this time of year, you definitely want to tune into this podcast because Josh is going to be bringing some helpful insight. So we definitely want to say that we appreciate y'all tuning in. There's a lot of other podcasts out there that you could be listening to. So if y'all don't mind, head on over either to Spotify, Apple, or wherever you're listening to this podcast, and make sure you go on there and rate and review that. That helps us out a lot. We really appreciate it. But nonetheless, we're going to dive into this podcast. We might go down a couple rabbit holes, but we hope y'all definitely take something from this, and we hope you enjoy. All right, Josh, well, welcome to the podcast, man. We're excited to have you here. How you doing today?
I'm doing just fine. How are you?
Oh, can't complain, man. Like we were saying, if you did, nobody'd want to listen, right?
That's right. I don't care.
Well, man, we just want to thank you for taking the time to hop on the HuntStand podcast with us. And today, I really want to dive into spring scouting. And I know the title of this podcast is going to confuse people a little bit, but we're going to title it Hunting for Whitetail in the Spring. But before we dive into that topic, I want to get the 30-foot tree stand view of who Josh Honeycutt is, and I want to let the listeners in on that. So tell us about yourself, man.
Yeah, I'm just a redneck from Kentucky who likes to deer hunt and turkey hunt as well, and chase small game and just do all things outdoors. So, I've been able to turn that into a career in the outdoor industry, working as a outdoor writer. Started part-time, kind of around the end of my high school days, beginning of college days, and I started working as an outdoor writer and photographer, videographer, just all things communications, and eventually that led to a full-time career in the industry, doing a variety of things for a variety of companies. I've been an employee for companies such as the National Wild Turkey Federation. I've worked for Real Tree Camouflage, different companies. But today I'm a full-time outdoor writer working for myself, doing traditional media work with magazines and websites and podcasts and hunting shows and just a variety of different medium. And also I run a content marketing agency where I partner with companies in the outdoor industry.
Awesome, man. Yeah, you can't complain much
Yes,
about
sir.
that. Got to turn your passion into career. Who got you hooked on deer hunting, and when did you realize that you wanted to follow that passion to make a career out of it?
Yeah, so I mean, it is a family thing, just about most people in my family, not everyone, but most people in my family do some sort of hunting, and so it was just kind of osmosis there as far as just being around it from a very young age. But it was one of those things where I grew to really enjoy it. Like other kids, I enjoyed sports, played baseball, played basketball until a certain point, but hunting was really what I truly cared about. And, I wanted to do something with the outdoor industry. I didn't know exactly what it was, but I wanted to try to at least try. And, one of the things that I was excelled at the most, in school was with, language arts and English. And so I found an avenue there to start out with, as far as writing and editing, and then just kind of went from there into all things communications.
Got it. Well, man, I think that's kind of where a lot of people start is, they love hunting. It's their passion, and they want to find out how they can turn that into a career. So kudos to you for, getting that figured out and loving it, man.
Yeah, thank you.
So I want to dive into spring deer scouting, or, hunting for whitetail in the spring, whatever you want to call it. There's all these different rabbit holes of spring deer scouting, how to do it, what to do, where to go, what to look for. And not only I want to learn this for myself, because me being from Texas, it's a whole different ball game down here when it comes to deer hunting compared to many other parts of the nation. So I want to learn this myself, but there's a lot of listeners out there that I think overlook this aspect of deer hunting as a whole. There's some people that take it very seriously, but I want to pick your brain on it and why spring deer scouting is so important.
Yeah, it is very important, and there's a lot of benefits from it. As far as what you gain from it, what it does for you, and it's just it's just a lot of preparation work is what it is. You're not going to be as well off this coming next season, so the 2022-23 season, if you don't conduct that postseason scouting.
So, I've looked at a multitude of videos, blogs, articles out there before, and it looks like a lot of people want to hone in, and I want to kind of cover each of these topics, but a lot of people hone in on when that first thaw or snow melt happens, shed hunting, bedding areas, travel routes, old rut signs. So I kind of want to dive into it with you on, what are you looking for as soon as the snow melts?
Yeah, so I mean, everywhere is different. We don't get a lot of snow here, so for me, I'm not so much waiting on snow as I am waiting on just the right time. Up north, obviously, further north, and I do hunt places that get more snow, such as Ohio, and other Midwestern states. But for me personally, as just being in Kentucky, obviously when it comes to shed hunting, you're just waiting on the right time, and the further north you go, generally, the earlier they start shedding their antlers. Further south you are, the later they do. Obviously, every deer individually is going to be different. Injury can cause early shed. Genetics, it can genetically be an early shedding deer.
Mm-hmm.
But just usually just from a Kentucky, typical, lower Midwest, southern Ohio, southern Indiana, that type, region, that general region. I'm looking to start shed hunting around the end of February. I'll start middle of February. But really, when it comes to, I shed hunt and postseason scout simultaneously. That way I don't have to cover, ground twice. Sometimes I will cover ground twice, especially shed hunting. If, the best areas, and I'll check some open areas, food sources more than once. But usually what I do is I will start that process by hitting the lowest odds places first, because I still want to give those deer, because, when I first start shed hunting and postseason scouting, not all the deer have shed.
Yeah.
So I'll start in those lowest odds places first, and lowest pressure places, so I'll start in food sources, open areas, places that, if it's private land, places I can check with a vehicle, or full ATV or something like that, that's, that doesn't necessarily push deer out of the area. And then, so I'm not knocking properties off one by one. I'm starting, in general, and hitting, multiple properties at a time, hitting the lowest odds place first. And then I'll work up, and, as it gets later and later toward the end of February, beginning of March, middle of March, that's when I start hitting those more sensitive areas, such as bedding areas, sanctuaries, staging areas, places that are closer to where deer spend their daylight hours this time of year.
So when you say lower odds areas, kind of go into that a little bit deeper for me. What do you mean by low odd in areas?
Yeah, well, generally I find more of the sheds that I discover, they're in, they're closer to bedding areas. That may not be everyone's experience, but that has been mine throughout the years. Most of the, sheds that I find are, in cover. So they might not all be in actual bedding areas, but, they're relatively close to those. And in places where if I'm, walking around through there, bedded deer might see me, hear me, smell me, or, come through there and catch my ground scent later and potentially push them out of there before they have an opportunity to drop their antlers. So I tend to save those areas for later. Those are what I call higher odds shed find places. Lower odds, because I don't find as many. I still find a lot of sheds out in the open. I shouldn't say that, it's quote unquote low odds, but it's lower odds than, bedding areas, staging areas, places that are, have cover. So those are what I would consider lower odds, but a better term probably, like I said, is lower pressure. And it just, again, it's just trying to maximize the odds of finding as many sheds as possible. But you have to start that, if you cover a lot of ground, which I have access to a few pieces of private, but I also do a lot of scouting on public land. And if you're going to cover all, as much land as possible, you got to start that process before every single deer is shed, or you won't ever get through it all. So, that's why I start with the lower odds places first. And that also has to do with starting with the properties that I care the least about first. And I do that because it just gives those properties that I know have, some mature, more mature target bucks that, I want to find sheds to. And obviously I don't want to pressure them either, even after the season.
Yeah.
So I save those better properties, toward the end of the process.
Gotcha. So how important for spring scouting, when you're looking at shed hunting or you're looking for bedding areas, how important is e-scouting for you?
Yeah, so I do a lot of that with new properties. I look at maps all the time, even properties that I've hunted for years. But it's especially important for hunting new properties, because and that's something that I do during the off season. I have a goal of scouting at least one new large public land area each off season. That's my goal. Yeah. If not more, and that starts with e-scouting. I'm a bit, as we know, this is a HuntStand podcast. I use it quite often. I look at it daily, and it's just one of those things where you really gain a lot by e-scouting. You can learn. It really just saves you time just from that off-season scouting perspective, because it allows you to kind of focus on areas that you won't want to walk. Maybe it's a place that, like, for example, you're not going to do a lot of postseason scouting on a north-facing slope. Not to say that you won't scout those areas, but if you're just purely shed hunting, you're going to spend more time on south-facing slopes because they get more sunlight in the wintertime. That's where deer bed down oftentimes. They get more direct sunlight, stay a little bit warmer. So it just basically helps prioritize things. Yeah. Whether you're prioritizing what order you want to scout a place in, if you just don't want to go, spend any time, say you're going on an out-of-state scouting mission on some public land and you know that there's particular areas you just won't have time to cover, and you want to set, go after those better spots. Well, e-scouting helps you figure out where those might or might not be without actually having boots on the ground, whereas you're kind of going in blind if you don't e-scout.
Gotcha. So when you're going in looking at a new piece of property that you've never put your boots on the ground, how are you finding these bedding areas? Like, what are you looking for on the maps when searching for bedding areas to go in and try and find sheds?
Yeah, so there's different types of bedding. Generally, more times than not, deer are just going to be bedding in the thickest, nastiest stuff they can find.
Yeah.
That's just where they're at. So the thickest, nastiest cover you can find, that's where they're going to be bedding at. If it's super mature timber, and you can kind of tell, you can't always tell, but a lot of the times you can tell how thick it is based on, especially if you're using an aerial map.
Right.
There's certain different layers in HuntStand that show the canopy a little bit better than others. But you can definitely use different layers in the app to determine which ones look like more mature timber, which ones look like, more early successional habitat that's a lot younger as far as the successional clock goes. Thick, cover, you want stuff with a high stem count. Basically, limited visibility as far as seeing through it. If you can see a long ways through it, deer probably aren't going to bed there. If you can only see 10, 15, 20 yards, you can bet deer are going to bed there. But there's different types of bedding. Just general thick cover is obviously what you're looking for, but you can break it down into other categories as well. Like you said, south facing slopes, most people refer to that as solar bedding because you're getting that direct sunlight. There's also thermal bedding, which is going to be, based on conifer stands. If you have dense pockets of cedars, pines, spruces, different conifers that hold their foliage throughout the year, throughout winter as well, that helps hold heat. It helps shield them from snow and rain, helps shield from wind. And oftentimes those areas are a few degrees warmer, than the surrounding areas that are, hardwoods based, because they do help shield from the elements. And so deer like to bed there as well. And so that's, called thermal cover. But, there's just lots of different types of bedding. Whether it's solar, thermal, just thick cover. And like I said, a lot of the times deer like that thick cover because they don't, especially in wintertime, they don't prefer that during early season. Sometimes during the early season, they might prefer a more open area when it's hot.
Yeah.
They want that area. They want to breeze. They might bed at lower elevations because they want to be closer to those low-lying areas where it's cooler, closer to water. Whereas during the late, in late winter when it's cold, they want to be at higher elevations. So typically you'll find them at higher elevations in the wintertime. That's another thing to think about. But like I said, they do prefer that thick cover with a lot of early successional habitat and growth, high stem count, because they don't like to move very far in winter. They're trying to conserve calories, conserve energy. And so, they want their bed and food to be as close together as possible so they burn as few calories as possible. And you can get both with a really high stem count, early successional growth type area, because they can bed in that and feel safe and secure. And they can also feed on that because this time of year, there's not a lot of options out there, especially in places that I hunt, like southeastern Ohio, where there's not much ag or grain or anything like that. They can get that browse that they rely on and need, especially this time of year.
Gotcha. So my question then is, how, obviously it sounds like depending on the piece of property, depending on the area, they could have a completely different bedding area in the fall then, is kind of what I'm understanding.
Yeah, so my experience, no matter where you hunt, and I've hunted, the swamps of South Carolina, the plains of southwestern Kansas, here in central Kentucky, where it's not mountains but rolling hills and fields, mountains and foothills of Ohio. Everywhere I've ever hunted, I have noticed that deer are constantly changing where they bed. Very few properties, you might see deer bed in a particular bedding area, they might use a particular bedding area throughout the year, but more times than not, especially the mature bucks who are taking up the best of the best bedding. And then you obviously filter down, does and younger bucks are going to take the subcategories, but, the mature bucks, if that's what you're after, they're going to take the best of what the area has to offer. And that's going to change throughout the year based on what their needs are at the time. And there's factors that are involved there, such as time of year, which is temperature, weather, hunting pressure, available food sources, wind direction at the time, because that influences where deer will bed oftentimes based on what the wind direction is, because it's a security based thing. So there's a lot of factors that play into to help a deer decide where it's going to bed on a given day. And that can change daily, especially in big timber and hill country, mountain country, where there's endless cover, or at least seemingly endless cover. There's more options there. So you're going to see a greater variance in where deer bed, especially in areas like southeastern Ohio, where you have a lot of different cover options, in places like the Midwest, where it's just pockets of timber here and pockets of timber there, and most are open. Obviously, deer can be more limited. So it's really geographic based, it's time of year based, but bedding opportunities or bedding areas oftentimes change throughout the year based on what deer need at a given time.
Got it. So another topic that I saw a lot of people talking about when it comes to spring deer scouting is you're looking for travel routes. You're looking for old travel corridors, because there's a multitude of factors that those travel routes of what they can tell you. So, I mean, is that something that you're looking for quite often, or you're just primarily focusing on trying to find bedding areas?
So I'm on the private properties that I hunt are generally small. They're 200 acres or less.
Yeah.
Most of them are anywhere from 50 to 100, and I scour every inch of those properties. I literally grid search the entire property.
Yeah.
And so I'm covering everything. I'm looking for bedding areas, travel routes, staging areas, food sources, water sources. And something that I personally like to do is turn my tracker on, and it follows me. But I don't turn it on when I'm doing that the entire time. What I like to do afterward, if time allows, is go back and walk with the tracker on, walk every trail that I can find inside of bedding areas, inside of transition areas, staging areas, travel routes. No matter what type of trail it is, I walk the trails with the tracker on, and I always stay on a trail. That way I'm not having false lines. But what that does is, after the fact, when I've walked that entire property and walked every trail that I can possibly find, it then lights up, on that app, on HuntStand, the entire trail network on that property. And so what you'll see by doing that is it'll identify, heavier intersections where you might have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or however many trails that come together. It just shows you how deer really traverse and maneuver that property, and it's going to help you identify not only how they use it, but how you should use it as a hunter. So that's really the best thing you can do when you're postseason scouting is, hey, how does a deer use this property? And that's one way that I like to figure out, how they do that. It paints a picture, it lets you visualize it. And simultaneously, while I'm also doing, this postseason scouting, when I'm out there just grid searching, which again, I don't have the tracks on when I'm grid searching. Well, I do, because it helps me see where I've been and where I haven't been. But what I like to do while I'm on that first run, if I have time, which I don't have time for every property, but if it's an important property that I really want to focus on, I'll do that first run of the property with the tracks on, just to grid search the entire place. And then after I'm done, I delete those tracks out to know, they're just there to show where I've been, where I haven't been. And then I will mark all the findings, with all the different HuntStand icons that are available, such as scrapes, rubs, tracks, trails, whatever it might be at the time, anything of interest. And then I go back with those markers still in place. I'll go back and I'll do the charting of all the trail networks. And then with all of that available, it lights up. And then I'll take a screenshot of that, or else, I'll just save it as a new layer or whatever, however you want to do it.
Yeah.
But then that helps visualize exactly what deer are doing on that property.
I like that. It's got me thinking about my piece of property right now. So another thing that I really saw was old rut sign, utilizing old rubs. If you can find some of those older mock scrapes, just old rut sign. Are you keying in on that a lot during the spring, or, what are you looking for that to tell you?
Yeah. So basically postseason, you need to do both postseason scouting after the season ends, and you also need to do summertime scouting. And those plans look different for me personally.
Okay.
Postseason scouting, I am focusing on pre-rut, rut, and late season. Because obviously the rut sign you can find, which deer will rub they don't rub year round. They rub when they got their antlers on, but they'll scrape year round. It's not as frequent or as heavy, but deer do scrape year round. So, what I basically do there is I'm looking for those rubs and scrapes from the previous season. So that helps me identify where deer were spending the tail end of the pre-rut and the rut, because most rubs are laid down during the pre-rut. And, there's some that are laid down during the rut too, but a lot of those are laid down during the pre-rut, especially the tail end of it right before the rut kicks off. So that helps me kind of identify where deer are spending time during the pre-rut and the rut, and where I find sheds, where I find the most recent tracks and trails that are maybe a few days, few weeks old, are telling me where deer spend time during the late season. And so that really helped. And of course, I have cameras that stay up throughout the season. Some of those I'll check during the season periodically to help me in my hunting. But a lot of those cameras that I actually put up never get checked, and they just soak all season long. And so a lot of what I do, just to minimize pressure as far as trail cameras go, because I don't like to check every single trail camera that I have, especially those that are further back in cover, closer to bedding areas and staging areas. A lot of times if I do happen to check one of those, it's because it's on my way into a tree stand. But I'll let those soak throughout the year, and what that does is it tells me how individual deer use the area, but as a whole tells me how the herd uses it as well. And that's applicable just in general. So, say you've got a big deer that's in there next year, maybe a new deer, might be a return deer, but regardless, how deer use the property, while it can change from year to year, oftentimes it doesn't, just, in general terms, because whatever most mature buck is in there this next year is going to be taking the best bedding that was being used by the most mature buck the previous year. So, it's just one of those things where, trail cameras are good for in real time, use, but it's also when you go back through and look at cameras that soak in those most sensitive areas, you get that historical data that's going to be applicable, unless the landscape changes, is going to be, applicable each year.
Gotcha. So I want to touch on what you're just talking about with mock scrapes, because this is kind of a not really talked about thing in Texas, if you will. But, this past year I got to go hunt in Nebraska for the first time, where, obviously there's no baiting, you can't even use anything like your Big and J, or, no powders or anything like that, not even salt licks or mineral licks. So we were making a lot of mock scrapes, but something that I've been doing some research on is there's people that use mock scrapes year round. So is that something that you do to kind of help during this post season spring scouting time?
Yeah, so one of the things that, like I said, deer scrape year round, so mock scrapes are going to be valuable year round. I'll put my cameras, I take them down while I'm postseason scouting and shed hunting just to clean them up. I run about 40 to 50 cameras each year just on across all the different areas that I hunt. So I'll have anywhere from 5, 6, 7 of those tear up on me each year and have to either fix them or replace them. Mm-hmm. And so I do pull them down. But I'll put those back up in June, except for certain public land properties that have restrictions on when you can and can't put them up. But in general, especially on the private lands that I hunt, those get put back up in June, at the latest early July. And if I do happen to want to run mock scrapes, not to say that I won't create those in season as well from time to time as needed, but generally if I'm going to do a mock scrape, I'll go ahead and jumpstart that. When I put those cameras back out in the summertime, because deer will scrape year round, and it just gives deer a lot more time to get used to that disturbance that I put out there, by making the mock scrape, putting up the trail camera, this, that, and the other. It gives them months rather than days or weeks to recover from that human intrusion. And I'm not a biologist, but I do enjoy reading over a lot of the biology reports that come out and research reports that come out from all the different, whitetail university in the country, or universities in the country, such as Penn State, Auburn, Texas A&M, all the different, Mississippi, all the different, popular ones and biggest ones. But, there's a lot of research that suggests that it takes anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks for deer to fully recover from human intrusion. They might be back in there in a few days, but for them to fully go back to normal, it can take up to 3 weeks for that to happen.
Wow.
And so that's why I like anything that's super intrusive. I like to get it done in the summertime. So most of the tree stands hanging that I do is going to be done in the summertime. Like I said, I'll do it in season too if I need to, if I deem that it's important. But just in general, as far as getting the bulk of my tree stands hung and stuff like that, I'm doing it way in advance, as early as possible.
Yeah, heck, I know we're talking about doing that here in the next couple of months. Just, we've got a small parcel of land that we hunt on here in Texas, and we're talking about doing that in the next few months because I've seen that where I may have gone in too late and hung something up, and it just boogers them up for, a good portion of the season. So, lessons learned.
And every deer herd reacts differently. That's something that I've noticed. Even in the same area, like for example, I've got 2 or 3 properties that I hunt here at home, close to home, and every single one of those properties, the deer herds react differently to hunting pressure. So I've hunted them for years, and I know how deer react. And there's one property in particular that you bump a deer once, and it just screws things up. But there's the other 2 properties are different. One of them, you can apply much more pressure, and they just seem to absorb it. So it's just weird how that happens, even on properties that are relatively close to one another. But yeah, the earlier the better. This is a great time of year. Like I said, I don't always do it, so I'd be a hypocrite if I said I did, but I do safety checks on all of my tree stands every year. I like to pull as many as I can down. I don't always get every single tree stand pulled down, but it is good and proper to do so. That way you can do, really in-depth maintenance and safety checks on them, make repairs. If they're beyond repair, throw them away. But at the same time, I like to get tree stands up this time of year as well. Like you just said, y'all are getting ready to do that.
Yeah.
Simply because this time of year, because if you're going to hang a tree stand, you're going to have to cut shooting lanes, unless you're on public.
Yeah.
And this is the best time of year to do that. Because a lot of the times, if you cut shooting lanes in the summer, which if I'm hanging a tree stand, I still cut shooting lanes in because it needs to be done. But the best time to do it is now, because it's very easy to remove too much. When you're cutting shooting lanes in the summertime when the leaves are off, and then all the leaves fall, and you're like, oh, I'm exposed. So
yeah,
it's just one of those things.
Yeah, because now you still, you're essentially going to be hunting in the same type of cover, if you will, rolling into the fall after all that summer growth and everything has kind of died off after freezes.
Yeah, and like we were saying, my summertime, my postseason, I do a lot of postseason scouting. The first phase is February, March, and then the second phase is in the summertime, and that looks a lot different, and that's a long discussion in and of itself. But like I said, the postseason scouting right after the season ends, that's really targeting pre-rut, rut, and late season for the following year. And then summertime is targeting. Well, it takes inventory of what deer have already returned, which some of them won't return until they shift in the fall. But it at least tells you what deer might be there or probably will be there for the early season. And summertime scouting is really what drives me as far as my early season plans go. And I'll be honest, early season is my favorite time of year to deer hunt. I prefer it over the rut. I prefer it over the late season. That's when I've had the most success. Most of my biggest bucks are early season deer. I've shot, I think, from 2015 to 2018, I shot 3 different velvet bucks. And let's see, 2015 was a velvet buck. 16 was not. I did arrow in a velvet buck that year, but was non-lethal and the deer survived. And then 17 and 18 were velvet deer. I just prefer it. I just prefer it over the other times of year. But the summertime scouting I do is what drives that part of the season. So it's different. You can't just because you find a shed in a bed this time of year doesn't mean he's going to be there during the early season. Right. But there's a good chance that that's going to translate to next late season because whatever they were doing at the end of deer season is probably what they're doing right now.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm glad you brought up some velvet deer hunting because that was, we're talking spring scouting and everything or postseason scouting, but I wanted to talk about, when I was doing a little bit of research on you, and I've seen this giant 170-inch velvet 8-point that you shot with your boat early season. Tell us about that deer, man. That was a freaking giant. That was a stud.
Yeah, he's a pretty cool deer. Whenever I green scored him, he was right there at 170 gross. I think officially he ended up being in the mid 60s, but of course he lost a little bit when he dried up after the drying period, especially velvet deer. They do that. But,
Yeah.
I also probably stretched the tape a little bit more. But yeah, he ended up being
Who
in
doesn't,
the
right?
mid-60s. Yeah, right. All right, fishing, we're fishermen too, and we got to tell a good tale. So,
Oh, yeah.
but yeah, he ended up being officially in the mid-60s for gross, and he would have been net, 170 if he hadn't had a little bit of a damaged G2. He's got a little acorn tip halfway up his right G2,
Yeah.
which he damaged at some point during the growing phase. So if not for that, he would have officially netted around 170.
Oh.
But he's a pretty cool deer, yeah, and he's a deer I followed for 2 seasons. Shot him in 2018. He actually showed up in 2017 for the first time. I got a trail camera picture of him a couple of weeks after I shot my velvet deer in 2017, and he showed up in the exact same spot. And what's interesting is, this is another discussion for another time, but, figuring out the X, so to speak, every property, especially small properties, are only going to have 1 or 2 quote unquote X's or kill spots that consistently produce.
Yeah.
And my velvet deer in 2015, the velvet deer I shot in 2017, and then this big velvet 8 in 2018 were all arrowed on the same 50-acre property and within probably 75 yards of each other. So, so that's another discussion and something that you can learn over time hunting a particular property. You can also help, reveal where these locations are at when you do these postseason scouting, whenever you look at trail cameras that soak for throughout an entire season.
Yeah.
So it's not something that you learn immediately, but hunting a place over time, scouting a place over time, you can reveal where these locations are at. And that's really what led to me being able to arrow that big 8-pointer.
So with this deer showing up, after you shot another deer, let me rephrase this. Was spring scouting or postseason scouting crucial and part of the process in killing this deer?
Yeah, well, it wasn't. Postseason scouting wasn't so much important for this deer, simply because, like I said, he was an early season deer. I knew that I monitored this deer in 2017 after I filled my tag. Obviously, I couldn't hunt this deer, so I just had to watch him. But I monitored him on trail cameras. I think I ended up getting probably 10, 12, maybe 15 daylight pictures of him on the property throughout the rest of the season. So not super regular, and it was a small property. It's 50-acre property, and only probably 25 acres of it is cover. So really, it's even less huntable ground. It was interesting. The biggest factor for killing this deer was preseason scouting, not postseason scouting. So summertime scouting with trail cameras was very important because I put up trail cameras and I monitored those. Now,
Yep.
I was very careful. I never put my feet on the ground, and I kept trail cameras on the perimeters of fields. That way I could drive up to them with the truck. I didn't even want to take an ATV in there because it was louder. I would drive my truck up, open the door, pull the card, close my door. Very, very non-intrusive because I knew that deer was bedding pretty close. And so figuring out what he was doing was key. Knowing that the particular area that I arrowed him in was kind of where everything comes together on that property was key, and I already knew that from previous years. But, a big thing was I started out because this deer, he was on a daylight pattern all summer long. And about a week before season, he kind of shut down and started going dark, and I was looking at nighttime pictures. Well, I thought, he's already shifted to a new bedding area or he's doing something different. Well, turned out he really wasn't. I didn't even hunt the deer the first day of the season, I think. Maybe the first 2 days of the season. I can't exactly remember now. It's been too many years, but I know I didn't hunt him opening day. I don't think, but I did end up going in there maybe the next day, and I did some observation sits, and started out just kind of back off the deer, realized that he hadn't changed his pattern all that much, but he was just changed it just slightly enough that he was missing cameras. And so he wasn't coming back through and hitting those cameras until way after dark, after, he'd been, out doing his business. So, when it comes to early season, especially when deer are on patterns, you can get as much of that figured out during the preseason as you can. But sometimes, to fine-tune that game plan, especially in areas where you can kind of hunt observation sits, but you can't do that everywhere, But that is really the final point of your preseason scouting in summer that you pull together. Whenever you finally do start hunting that deer that's on a pattern, you're going to have to do some, or you won't always have to, but you might have to do some observation sets to pull the rest of that scouting plan together to create that opportunity.
I love it, man. So going back to our postseason spring scouting, for the listeners out there, what would you say is probably that 1 to 2 pieces of advice that you would have for them going into that right now? We're starting to get some snow melts in some parts of the country. There's a lot of other parts that they're covered in snow, and they will be for the next month or so. But what would you say from your perspective are 1 to 2 good pieces of advice going into that spring deer scouting?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things that I'm trying to figure out, especially with my trail camera pulls, the last card pulls, is figuring out what deer lives through the season. You aren't going to know all of that information, but you can try to pull as much of that together as possible. And so what you're doing this entire off season with postseason and summertime scouting is you're pulling together game plans. And something that I do throughout the years, I'll go back through and look at all the metadata. That's what I call it anyway. It's not true metadata, but that's what my reference to it, from every single daylight trail camera picture I had of a mature target buck. And I will look at everything that's associated around that timestamp, such as direction of travel, or what the date was, but in direction of the date, time, morning or afternoon, where he was coming from, where he was going to, what the wind direction was on that particular sighting. That way I can kind of identify, okay, he was using this bedding area on this particular wind, he was going in this direction on this particular wind. And deer don't always walk with their nose into the wind. They'd all be on a beach somewhere if that was the case.
Oh yeah.
But they do use it to their advantage, and they're very big on sometimes when it is convenient, they'll walk into the wind or they'll use a crosswind, whatever it might be. Deer are smart; they know where tree stands are located. Oftentimes, especially if they've picked you off in one. That's what I'm doing. I'm looking at all that information, and then I'm pulling together game plans for the following season for each phase of the season. So if I know a deer is going to be there during the early season, that's his MO, that's what he typically does, I'm going to create some game plans around that particular deer for that time of year. If it's a deer that likes to stay all season long, I'll have game plans for that deer based on what he typically does throughout each phase, so early season, pre-rut, late season. Now, obviously, all these plans aren't going to come together, and you've only got 1 tag, maybe 2 tags, depending on where you're hunting, or if you're in the South, you'll have more. But, being able to have all these game plans already on paper, and I do like to write them down just so I don't forget them, one of those is going to come together, more likely than not. And if you've got 2 tags, then hopefully 2 of them come together. But having all of these in place, helps you kind of really put it down and remember what your game plan is come season. And of course, obviously, what happens in real time, you're going to have to adjust these things. You're not living, it's not written in stone, but it's a starting point. And having that starting point based on what you find and discover during the postseason here, and during the early season or preseason this summer, all of that coming together is going to give you a starting point for the following year, which is really all you can ask for.
Got it, man. Well, I think these are all great tips for all the listeners out there, especially just for the time of year that we're going into. Deer seasons are pretty much done across the nation with the exception of some MLD properties here in Texas, but for majority of folks, deer season's done, and now everybody's starting to think about next year. And I know for sure I definitely want to get you on here to talk some more summer scouting stuff, right before the season kicks into high gear in, late August, early September. So I know we're definitely going to have to get you on the podcast again, man.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And the only other thing I would say right now is don't, when it comes to this postseason scouting, don't think you know everything about the property you've been hunting, even if you've been hunting it for 20 years, because things can and they do change. They change annually. The big things stay the same as long as the habitat hasn't. But, that's something that I've messed up on the past. I didn't postseason scout a property like, it's going to be the same next year. And then I went in there and found, oh, goodness, they've made some changes here. Whether somebody come in and they did this or they did that, and then, it's a whole new ball game. It starts at zero. So, things change. change, even on properties that you've known for a long time, especially if it's a property that you have permission on or you lease and you don't own. Then there's going to be more opportunity, higher odds of something changing there without you knowing it. But there's, even storm damage. We've recently had a lot of storms here the past few months here in Kentucky, and that can change things. If a tornado comes through and starts ripping, hardwoods apart, that just created a whole new bedding area. It might take a year or two for it to grow up and thicken up, but that's a new bedding area a lot of times because they like that urbanization growth. So that's just one of those things. Just don't think you know what's going on, even if you've been there for a long time, because things can change.
Dude, that happens to me all the time at our place. We've got 200 acres here in Texas, but really only about 80 to 100 of it is actually huntable because all the front part of it is all just coastal fields. And it seems like every year, I think I've got them dialed in, got them figured out. Then the next year rolls around. Like this past year, these deer threw me for a loop. Completely different than what they had normally been doing. They were going on different travel routes, and it threw me for a loop, man. They change up every year on this place.
Yeah. Yeah, and some properties are like that more than others. Some properties, it's just like, oh, they do this, they do it that way every single year. Other properties seem more random. It's just weird, how deer herd to deer herd and from property to property. Oftentimes things change or are different. Whether it's that aspect or it's the hunting pressure aspect or whatever it is. It is interesting how unique they are.
Yeah, because the weird thing about it was we typically. We've got two fields that we typically plant oats in because I wouldn't necessarily say it's a working cattle ranch. We've got cattle on the property, and we've got some other family out there that they bale the oats, and the deer love that. And we didn't plant any this past year because we've got pigs out there that they've just been tearing up everything. And I think the pigs probably had a big part in why these deer were so different, because the year prior, I think we only had 1 or 2 pigs rotating through the property, but this year there was anywhere between, I'd say, 40 and 60 pigs just rotating through our property as well as 3 other neighboring pieces. And so I noticed that these deer were spending a lot of time up in one of these fields. There was no oats planted, but I think it was just probably some leftover from last year that sprouted and just some browse that was out there. But they had spent the majority of their time up there like they had never done in the past 4 or 5 years. It was strange.
Yeah, it's very interesting for sure, how things influence that. And one other thing that came to mind that I meant to mention and failed to is, as you said, we're doing this postseason scouting right now to put together game plans. But, I'll put out permanent, quote unquote permanent or tree stand locations that I, may or may not get used come the next season.
Yeah.
I'm also very mobile. I have a set that I just, use to hang and hunt and stuff like that. But, figuring out these stand locations is really what all that's about, that postseason scouting, especially, when you're establishing permanent historical stand locations that are going to be good from year to year. Getting those hung during the off season is good too. But one thing to think about is that tree stand is only as good as its entry and exit route. And there have been so many times that I've found, oh, this is a dynamite spot. This is going to be a killer spot every year. And then come to find out it was not, simply because I could not get to that tree stand without pressuring deer, or I couldn't get back out without pressuring deer. And if you can't get there without pressuring deer, it's good for no sits. If you can get there but can't get back out, it's good for 1 sit. So,
yeah.
But that is something that that also varies based on property, based on geographic location. Obviously in the Midwest, where deer are a little more, or southeast, or somewhere where you've got pockets of cover, it's easier to pressure deer out of the areas there and push them onto new properties because they have fewer bedding area options. And so obviously that changes from place to place. And obviously I worry a little bit less about pressuring deer in huge big woods, big timber areas, not because I'm not worried about pressuring them, just because the likelihood, and I shouldn't even say likelihood, but it's just different. Like there in those hill country and mountain country of eastern Ohio, there deer don't bed in the same place every day. It's not random. It seems random, but it's not. They do things for a reason, I think. But they hopscotch a little bit more than they would in areas with fewer bedding options. It's just there. It's just endless cover, endless terrain. So when I say I'm not as worried about pressuring deer, that's not true. But I'm not as worried about hunting stands repeatedly in those areas, because oftentimes that's what it takes to intercept deer. Finding where those good stand locations are and then hunting them repeatedly, smart. You still want to, hunt it smart, but repeatedly to increase the odds of catching deer in those high odds areas, pinch points, funnels, whatnot, whatever type great stand location it is. But definitely during this off season, when it comes to finding those stand locations that they're going to, decide on as your permanent stands, determine whether you think or not it's going to be a good entry and exit route. If it's not, it's probably not going to be a good spot. But the good thing is you can figure that out now. You can go, if you know where deer typically bed, go to those bedding areas late. If you find a bed, lay down in it, look back toward where you're wanting to hang tree stands and see what they see. This time of year, it's and that's something I learned from Dan Infalt. He's been teaching that for years. So
that's a good idea.
Going into those bedding areas, finding the actual beds that are used frequently, which are probably going to be used by your more mature deer, especially in the best spots. Lay down, see what they see. You might just realize, they're seeing me come up this hollow or coming down this trail or whatever it is. And you've got trail cameras in the area, and they always seem to be in there when you're not. When you're there, they're not. So, oftentimes that's what it is. They're seeing you, hearing you, or smelling you come through there on your way to that stand or whatever it might be. But definitely figure out what stands have good entry routes, good exit routes. And the good news is, if in certain situations, you can create a good entry route. So, if it's a property you own, you can plant something like miscanthus or Egyptian weed or something that shields you, especially if the problem is visually. You can't do much about audible and wind and scent, stuff like that. But other than just find a new route or find a new stand location, but definitely something to think about as you're scouting during the postseason, and then getting your permanent historical stand locations ready for the following year.
Love it, man. These are all great tips. Great tips. Things to think about this time of year for all you listeners. These are definitely things that need to be done. So. Well, man, I really appreciate you hopping on the podcast with me today, just getting to pick your brain on essentially what to do this time of year. I know a lot of people are probably thinking about turkey hunting and, family vacations coming up in the summer and stuff, but I think for a lot of us, I know specifically yourself and me as well, these are the things we're thinking about right now. Like, yeah, turkey hunting's coming up, but, man, this is the kind of stuff that I'm thinking about and gearing up and getting ready for the 22-23 season.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you having me on, and good luck to you and everybody out there who are getting ready for this coming fall.
And there you have it, everybody. We just want to thank Josh for hopping on the podcast with us and talking deer hunting, scouting tips and tactics, and we really hope that y'all learned something from this and learned something from Josh. If you want to find out more about Josh, or maybe you have questions you want to ask him yourself, head on over to Instagram. His handle is just @Josh_Honeycutt. So if y'all want to get in touch with him, pick his brain a little bit more, head on over there, follow him, and send him a message. And if you've got some questions for us, or you've got a topic idea that you want us to cover, send us an email. Send that on over to podcast@HuntStand.com. That way, make sure your voice is heard. But we just want to thank y'all for tuning in to an episode of the HuntStand podcast, and we will see you on the next one.